it's BlockchainBrad or Brad Laurie, and today we have a very interesting and exciting interview with none other than the CCO of Energy Web. His name is Jesse Morris, and it stands for the Chief Commercial Officer. Jesse, thank you very much for being here to explain all things about Energy Web and this new chain that's come on to the blockchain right now.
Thank you. Very excited to be here, Brad.
Likewise, mate. Now, for all those wondering, this is entirely free. There's no payment. There's no other agenda. This is about education, but also for transparency. It's important you know that I have put my money where my mouth is, put skin in the game, and I do own EWT. So, Jesse, let's go into this really deeply. Let's discuss everything in a more of a holistic fashion. And let's do it through, all the knowledge that you've built with your team. Let's start with what essentially EnergyWeb stands for. In terms of the holistic structure and design. It says on the website it's all about accelerating low-carbon, commercial, customer-centric electricity systems by unleashing the power of blockchain. That's a mouthful, that's a lot, and you could spend hours unpacking all of this in EnergyWeb. Do you want to just give us a quick rundown on what EnergyWeb as a term stands for?
Certainly. So the best way to answer that question is actually speak not about blockchain, but about what's happening in the energy sector for just a minute or two.
Okay.
So forget blockchain, forget decentralized technologies. Currently, the grid is decentralizing on its own. We are undergoing one of the biggest transformations since alternating current, and the grid is really being completely reinvented. So the best way to think about it is honestly with some numbers. Every year, if we go globally, utilities, so these big, large energy companies spend something like $750 billion a year on the grid. By 2030, you, me, companies, customers are going to be spending over $2 trillion per year on the grid. So the primary investor in the electricity system, it's going to be us. It's not going to be the utilities. And the question then becomes, well, what are we investing in? Are you and I investing in wires and big thermal power plants? No, we're investing in solar, in wind, in electric vehicles, in smart thermostats, in devices that allow us to control when we use electricity. All of those assets, those are the assets that can really form the basis of the new electricity system. But there's a problem. Those assets are completely islanded from the way the grid operates today. And that's where EnergyWeb comes from. Our vision, even 3 years ago when we were just learning about the specific role blockchain plays, our vision was to provide that connecting infrastructure or that web between all of those different devices that we as customers are investing in and the utilities. So that's kind of where the nomenclature of EnergyWeb comes from. And that's really our mission, is to provide that foundational global digital infrastructure to support a low carbon grid of the future.
It's really interesting also because when we talk about web, often there's this association with that legacy model that we now see, or the Google version that we see. But really, we're talking about the emergence of blockchain in such a way where it can benefit with this new digital, iterations of technology that are coming forth now, looking at the benefits of blockchain to optimize this initiative that is enterprise focused. And we're going to get into that, exactly what that means as well, Jesse. But before we do, I just want to acknowledge a couple of people, if that's okay. I wanted to acknowledge Bag Hunters, also HSV, GTS as a researcher. I want to also acknowledge Shoda or Showboy on Twitter, and Hafagonia. The reason I want to acknowledge them is that they did support my own research very early on in May, and I want to thank them for that, for their work, because often, in this space, it's a shared effort, it's a shared endeavor, and we all need to stick together to find great research, great projects, and great initiatives for the future of both blockchain and enterprise more generally, as we see digital assets come on board for the future of business. Now, let's talk about enterprise, Jesse, in this context that you've referenced, because it's one thing to have a very benign or a project that's really suited to the future of energy. It's another thing to make sure that that's going to also align with the interests of enterprise. So do you want to just touch on this statement that EnergyWeb have made? It says that you're the world's first open source enterprise blockchain specifically tailored for the energy sector. So that's not just looking at the green side of this and then, attracting a really niche market. This is a huge market, as you mentioned, with trillions of dollars at stake.
Definitely. So before I speak about the tech, to really answer what does that mean with enterprise grade, we'll just speak about kind of our objectives here. You're right. the grid is much more than these solar panels and electric vehicles, but it's really about the companies that actually operate the system. And if you step back just to say something that might be a little controversial, there were dozens of energy blockchain startups circa 2017 that were on the market, right? I would estimate that 80 to 90% of the concepts and marketing that those companies were putting out was largely that. It was marketing. Talk about blockchain and peer-to-peer energy markets and greening the grid. Okay, high level, but what did that really mean? So for us, we kind of always knew what that meant. That meant convincing large enterprises that are responsible for these hundreds of billions of dollars a year in investment in completely changing the way that they do business. So that's our go-to-market, if you think of it that way. And again, I'll speak about the tech in a minute, but our go-to-market is to bring together these large corporates, AMO, the Australian energy market operator in Australia in your backyard, the dozens of other utilities in Australia, the many in our ecosystem, bring them around the table, help them understand the business case behind blockchain and decentral digital tech more generally, and then get them to implement that. Because if we can't do that, just to be clear, this, we call it in the climate space, the energy transition. This transition away from thermal power plants and towards green, resilient technologies, it simply won't happen unless these enterprises are on board in some way, shape, or form. So that has always been our thinking and the reason we architected it as we have.
Right, and it's really interesting also, when we do get into tech a little bit more in this interview, one of the proponents of enterprise blockchain recently tweeted out that even models like POA, the proof of authority, won't work unless you have that ecosystem behind you, that network. And so that's where this web is going to be so fundamental. And as you mentioned, that $1 trillion statement isn't to FOMO, but behind that are some of the largest energy industry related companies and corporations and consortia in the world. So you're already building this substantial network for enterprise, and then underpinning that is the tech you've taken a long time to build with your team. So let's touch on the team for a moment. Now, I had a look, and I have to tell you that very rarely do you see these kind of credentials on screen on those websites to really explain. And that again is not to FOMO, it's just the truth. So it was divided into some categories I had a look at. So some you had very strong business representation through Oriel, Doug, Jesse, yourself, and Rafaela. You had very, very strong blockchain expertise built into your team. I won't go into them all, but led from Walter all the way down to Mario and everyone between. So I'm sorry if I don't name you all. And you had a lot of others. But what I also like is that you didn't remove marketing from the equation as well. So you built that in. So Jesse, do you want to just touch on the team itself and how this evolved, how it built, and just how secure you are feeling about the skill sets of these people that now form the EnergyWeb and EnergyWeb chain team?
Wonderful question. I mean, look, we've been around since what feels like ancient times in blockchain. We started putting this thing together in mid-2016. And from the beginning, the team really had two different qualities that followed through to this day. So on one side, complete energy market professionals. So people who can speak this enterprise language with utilities, really drill down on what is the business case of digital technology, which really gets lost in a lot of the blockchain conversation, if you're honest. If you can't convince an enterprise that there's a business case, they're not going to use the technology. Yeah. So half of the team really comes from that background of just deep energy market professionals. But then we're pairing it on the other side, which again is rare in this space, with technology professionals, specifically with a background in blockchain and decentral technologies. So down from our CTO, Mika, who had a lot of hands-on experience, both in traditional IT, but also in things like constructing wallets, et cetera. On down the team, we can go down to the person, just different sides of expertise on the technology side, whether we're talking about privacy, good documentation on how to actually make blockchain usable, wallet construction. The team is rife with those kinds of experts. And I think just the thing to underline that's unique is I feel, as you asked, Brad, extremely confident because we have that convergence of the technology side with individuals who really deeply understand the energy space.
Right. And, you also, or many of the parties being all around the world, but especially with some of those hubs like Berlin, one of the clear things is that you've really focused on the quality of this team as well. You haven't just assembled this overnight. This has been years in the making. And it is surprising to many people, myself included, that we haven't noticed you earlier. You've been very stealth, and perhaps that's been very wise because of all of the hype that drives a lot of the crypto side. But when it comes to blockchain, we do want to see that long-term innovation. Now, to achieve this, you've built a thing known as the EWC, or EnergyWeb chain. What's really interesting is that there is a notion of public built into this, as well as having a permissioned component with the POA. So I wanted to touch on that because some of the things you have done as a team, you built your own VM, as I understand, or if I'm wrong, correct me there, but you've also put in a DNA into your system with the decentralized operating system, or it being known as the EWDOS. And there's a lot more to it, but do you want to just touch on that fundamental aspect of the whole architecture when it comes to what's going to drive even the chain itself underneath that, with your tooling, with your tech suite, and most importantly, that DNA?
Definitely. So the best way to think about the technology stack we brought to market is to speak about that language of the decentralized operating system. So the EnergyWeb decentralized operating system is the full stack. And at the base of that stack is the EnergyWeb chain. So let's go ahead and start there. The EnergyWeb chain is a public proof of authority chain. And what that means is that it is permissionless. It is public on the access layer. So that means any developer, any company, any user, any device can actually access the network, just like you would with Ethereum. You could download a client and access the Ethereum network from anywhere. The difference is on the validation side, we have permissioned validators. Right. So in our case, there's about 25 of them right now, spanning 17 different time zones. We've got another 20 or so kind of in the queue that we're adding to the validator list over time. These are organizations in our ecosystem. Most are these large corporates that we've been speaking about, but we also do have some startups who have been with us for many years now, who are actively contributing to the work that we've been doing as EnergyWeb. So just at the chain level, that's the architecture. Permissionless on the top, permissioned on the bottom in terms of the validators. Now that, just to mention why we chose that architecture, I think is crucial, especially in juxtaposition to so-called private blockchains. Hyperledger is a good example, right? So Hyperledger gets a lot of play in the enterprise space, right? But there's a fundamental issue with using a, quote, private blockchain in our domain. And that has to do with the story I was telling about the assets. Think about what I described. The user story we're trying to create here is so that a customer with a thermostat or a battery or an electric vehicle or a solar system can, at ultra low cost, have their assets be sending data and communicating with the grid operator. The moment you put a closed architecture on that system, which is a private blockchain, it's a closed architecture that you actually have to get permission for devices to do certain things, you really kill the business case and you ruin the value proposition. So I could go on at length about why we chose the public architecture, but it is a critical foundational building block of our stack.
Right, and I couldn't agree with you more, especially in 2020. There's a lot of discussion right now about that quadrant from public to private, or private to public, and also that permission to permissionlessness design. And there's a lot of literature now coming out about that, and debate. Also, interestingly, we can talk about that now. It's not actually in my notes in this order, but it is later, is the baseline. So as you know, yes, that initiative, that working group, I noticed you in there. I noticed you early on, in May, listed in that group. And what's interesting is that they too, led by consensus, and an initiative and working group are trying to lead out an enterprise-focused and enterprise-geared initiative to try and build out the potential of Ethereum, utilizing the same notion of public permissionless enterprise. So in that context, not only do you align very clearly, but you also have your own systems, your own technology. So without suggesting any kind of idea of competition, perhaps there's that co-opetition, or if there is such a term, where you're working, in sync, because I see a lot of synergies there. What are your comments on that?
That's totally how I look at it, right? So to be clear, EnergyWeb chain started as a clone of Ethereum mainnet, right? We loved all the innovation that's happening and still do in the Ethereum ecosystem, but clearly if we were going to construct this enterprise stack, a completely permissionless chain just wasn't going to fly as a starting point. So I think co-opetition in terms of baseline and what we're doing is a great frame. And I would actually frame this decentralized operating system on top of the chain as similar to baseline in terms of it's our attempt to make blockchain enterprise grade and usable. So the way to just spend another minute on the tech, because it'll kind of connect it to what's happening at Baseline, we primarily use the EnergyWeb chain as a ledger of identity, right? You can use the EnergyWeb chain for anything. You can download the client right now, you can purchase tokens, you can begin building applications, go for it. But for us, just putting the chain to market wasn't enough. So we've released additional technologies on top of the chain to really enable these enterprise-grade applications. And that's why for us, primarily, we use the blockchain as a ledger of identity. So what that means is, let's just go back to these assets I keep bringing up. Right. The way our technology stack works is we assign a digital identity using the W3C's decentralized identifier standard. We don't have to go deep into that, but it is a decentralized standard for digital identity, which is crucial. And those identities are given to every customer, every asset, every utility, every regulator, and those identities are anchored on the EnergyWeb chain, right? So we use blockchain only for what it's good at, which is establishing trust. And then we actually use some other technologies adjacent to the chain to do things like send messages, to do things like store data, sometimes on-chain, sometimes off-chain. And if you look at Baseline and actually some other initiatives, this is happening all over the place, using blockchain for specific functions. Right. It
really is. And what's really interesting is that more and more in the Baseline narrative that's coming out is not everything's going to be on-chain. It's a given that, for optimizing the blockchain, you have to have some of that removed. And you're talking about this right now. What's also really fascinating is that a lot of the tooling, a lot of the approach that you're taking as EnergyWeb are very similar actually to Consensus, to Baseline and Ethereum collectively. So I see a lot of synergies in your approach. But if we go back a bit, and we will touch on those later, I promise. But I want to talk about some of the features as well that you're building in. So things like low latency, high scalability, low transaction, I suppose, fees, I'm assuming there. And also moving to what is really interesting, and that is a more green approach, whereby it says that you are a leaner energy sort of consumer, in the sense of now moving to the POA as opposed to POW. Now, we know that Ethereum's moving to the POS model. It's going to be an interesting transition for them. You've come out of the blocks with this POA. So that suggests to me that it might be a case where Ethereum were paying attention to you as you're building.
I would hope so. And that was really important for us, right? If we just look at the Bitcoin network as an example, it uses as much electricity as a medium-sized country. Ireland is often used as an example. Our chain uses as much energy as a medium-sized office building, right? So, and it will stay that way. It is an incredibly energy-efficient chain, and that comes with proof of authority design.
Right. Okay. Now, I want to also explore the network. As you mentioned, web is important, but we haven't sort of looked at the nuts and bolts of this. Now, things that are included in the web are things like your renewable energy developers, and then that's obviously going to drive the innovation, the grid operators, the tooling itself. Now, for those who aren't aware, much like Consensus has a lot of their full stack of tooling available to both private and public sectors when it comes to blockchain innovation, you're looking at making sure that you have your own strong tooling suites. You've got the focus of the utility token itself and the ecosystem that's building out. So are there any areas that you really want to touch on when it comes to I guess, the driving factors for the web itself? What's prominent right now in 2020 as you build out the web?
Definitely. I think I'd like to talk about use cases and then also token economics. So on the use case side, the big difference with Baseline is that with the decentralized operating system, it is razor focused on energy. The problem I see with some of these other enterprise efforts is they tend to be a bit abstract. So trying to make blockchain support any variety of business cases. From a traditional venture capital investing perspective, supporting some of these companies, that makes sense. You don't want to limit yourself to a specific industry. From a technology perspective, it doesn't make sense because the more specific you can meet technical and business requirements, the more value you can unlock. And that's what we've done with the decentralized operating system. Okay. So really, we've designed the decentralized operating system to support two different really specific use cases. One is just helping customers see exactly where their power comes from. We call that Origin. It's one of the toolkits included in the decentralized operating system. And we are using Origin to help enterprises construct enterprise-grade markets for renewable energy globally. We're active in Turkey. We're active in Thailand, a number of other markets globally. Mm-hmm. The other use case is another piece of tooling that we've created called Flex. And it's all about more this device thing I keep bringing up, making it possible for your utility to trust that your electric vehicle will do something at a certain moment in time. They don't have that kind of capability right now. We make that happen. So those are the two use cases, and I really do think that's one of the big differentiators is our team has just focused. Initially, we had lists of hundreds of different use cases in the energy sector. And as we did more prototypes and rapid experimentation, we really zoomed in on those two.
Yeah, and what's interesting also, I had a bit of a read into both Flex and Origin, and I noticed you have key leaders in your team doing both those projects. But even moving beyond that, I mean, the fact that you have focused on the energy sector, that also puts you in a very unique situation, a very focused situation, as opposed to something like Baseline. Not to sort of suggest that they aren't, a very important key component for Ethereum, but they are taking a very holistic approach, even down to the GitHub.
Right.
So, their agenda is really trying to optimize Ethereum through this enterprise focus in a general sense. But you've really taken a very specific approach in your entire tech stack. And once again, your agenda is all about energy. It's all about making sure that you can bring the legacy models into the new era and make them relevant through digitization and through, digital assets and the blockchain, and even beyond that with the tooling.
And this is why co-opetition is so great. So because we are an open source with Baseline, with EnergyWeb, everything we do is completely open source. I know that in the next quarters, years, there's going to be swaps between the ecosystem where Baseline comes up with something, another project comes up with something, we integrate it. I mean, the digital identity standard itself we're using, it's not ours. It's created and supported by the W3C, but it made perfect business sense to integrate into our stack. So that's just the space we're in, and it's great.
Well, Jesse, let's talk about that. That was also part of the later interview. But when you talk about the Web3, when you talk about the foundation, we're talking Polkadot, we're talking certainly crossovers potentially even with Ethereum, with the potential of a lot of these technologies. Now, when we see things like Baseline, we see you join them. I immediately thought in my research, okay, what is possible with this, not just competition, but collaboration with some of these layer one chains, with some of these tech stacks, because for a long time, we've heard these very tribalistic narratives. We've heard a lot of these sort of crypto camps come forth. But what is the potential, and what can happen with EWC, EWF, with the foundation itself, even with the token? What can happen with this in terms of collaborating with some of these existing platforms and chains and technologies?
The future is multi-chain. The tribalism between some of these crypto communities has to grow up at some point. I understand there are conflicting interests because of different token models, et cetera. But just from the enterprise perspective, if I had to put a 5-year prediction hat on, the future is multi-chain, no question about it. We have already built bridges to mainnet Ethereum. We actually built one to the Libra testnet basically 2 months after the Libra paper was announced and their testnet went live. So we have bridges as a key part of our infrastructure. We are also looking at different parachain architectures. Given the use cases in our...
Can I just jump in? Well, that sounds like Polkadot to me.
Well, see, this is the thing. So given the use cases in our ecosystem and the transaction volumes, when you're not doing everything on chain, you don't actually need a parachain today, given the maturity and the level of sophistication of some of these applications. Eventually, it's going to get there. But frankly speaking, these enterprises just aren't there yet. So absolutely on our roadmap is to continue the evolution of the EnergyWeb chain towards a parachain environment, but we haven't picked a winner there. There's so much innovation in that space in and of itself.
We're going to find out, Jesse, because, as you dig deeper, you start to see Gavin Wood come up a lot, and you start to see a lot of things we're going to talk about later, such as GridSingularity and some of the other sort of key founding parties that help contribute to the evolution of EnergyWeb. But let's move across a little bit more to, I guess, the validators themselves. I did want to touch on this because you mentioned it before, but we're talking about some of the world's largest consortia, corporations, members. How did you get them? What was the process? What's currently happening? Do they act as clients or do they act as solely validators? Give us a bit of a rundown. Paint us a picture of the scope of these validators.
Definitely. So just to emphasize, we really started with these large corporates core to our story. When we started EnergyWeb, we said, if we can't get 10 of these organizations to fund the initial work of the EnergyWeb, we're probably not ready yet, right? So luckily we did, and we just continue to grow from there. We're at over 100 members and affiliates within our ecosystem. And again, as I said, about 25 of them are currently hosting validator nodes. If you want to just get a feel for what does the day-to-day look like within the EnergyWeb, so most of these companies indeed are hosting these validator nodes. There are bi-weekly governance calls to make sure everything's working in terms of security and the actual operation of the nodes. But also, frankly, 80% of the time with these corporates is actually helping them build solutions. Now, in some cases, our developers and our team are hands-on with these utilities, actually building applications on top of the decentralized operating system. In other cases, these companies have internal teams, and they're just using our open source or building their own tools on top of it. Engie, the French multinational company, is a really good example of that. They were the first organization to bring a live application to the main EnergyWeb chain, and that was something that we certainly collaborated on at the beginning, but then they took off and ran with it, which is exactly what we want to see happening. Right. We want to get all of these utilities to the point that they actually have empowered IT departments within the organizations to build applications, which is a far cry from where most of these companies are today.
Right, and just to add into that as well, Jesse, obviously that's how you can be more scalable too. When you offer that hub and that technology as, I guess, enterprise offering that they can, as you said, go and run with that. We're starting to see already that is possible. Now, again, the order's all mixed up, but in that sense also the applications or those DApps that we talk about, that also sort of, relates to what you're saying in terms of if these enterprise parties, world-renowned validators that are helping secure the network, but also more importantly, they are able to do real work in their own time with their own teams. What's happening in that space as well, Jesse, with regard to applications?
Great. So the most activity you've probably seen announced in the past couple of months, well, let me back up. The first round of applications really was on that Origin toolkit. So I mentioned Engie, the corporate, their application is all about helping corporate purchasers really see where their renewable electricity is coming from. It might sound a bit basic, but that is a massive requirement for these corporates to disclose how are they meeting their corporate social responsibility objectives on an annual basis. We also have a startup in our ecosystem called FlexiDAO. That's their focus as well. So helping to solve the problems around that use case. We're active as well. We've helped a company called PTT, which is a large oil company that is also active in power markets in Thailand, set up the country's first international renewable energy certificate marketplace. So that was really the story, frankly, for the first 6 months that the EnergyWeb chain was live. What's happening, though, is now we're seeing the first wave of these, we call them flex projects. So most relevant is actually we gathered requirements from a number of utilities, AMO in Australia being one of them, but then also in Austria and a number of players in Western Europe to help them deploy digital infrastructure to procure services from customer-owned assets, if I could just say it in a sentence. So that means, again, being able to control an app on my phone with some comfort settings and allow my battery to participate in an electricity market so I can actually make money as a customer. With Austria Power Grid, we just completed the first phase of that work with them, where we actually constructed an entire architecture on top of the decentralized operating system that would enable the entire country for that entire kind of marketplace to run. And now APG is moving on to the next phase of the project, and we're really excited to see the next steps there. And I can't name any other names, but
yes,
we are.
Come on.
Unfortunately, no. But again, 80% of the energy side of the EnergyWeb team's time is spent with multiple large utilities trying to get more projects like Austria Power Grid has put into market. The use case is always a little bit different. The regulations are different in all the different countries. But again, the technology underneath it, the decentralized operating system, we're taking that show on the road. That's our mission.
And Jesse, when I had a look at some of the I guess the members, those validators, once again, these are household names, some of them. Some of them obviously are specific to certain countries, as you mentioned. But what's clear is that we're talking about the highest levels of interaction from governments, from allegedly, we will assume that, because we're talking about countries that need power, talking about reinvigorating and revolutionizing how we can conceptualize power usage with new technologies like this. But, are you already having discussions at that high level beyond even the consortia at government? Because it would seem like that's inevitable.
Definitely. We have participated in multiple regulatory convenings and proceedings. One of my former colleagues actually was at a US Senate hearing on blockchain and cryptocurrencies 2 years ago now. So we have been at that regulatory table since day one. And honestly, this is one of the misconceptions, I think, about blockchain. So many times I've heard that blockchain is something to be regulated. Well, from a financial and securities perspective, of course, there's lots of, we don't need to talk about that.
Right.
But from an energy market perspective, blockchain is a tool. Regulators in the energy sector have to make sure that power is affordable and reliable. They have no, emphasize bottom line, no digital tools for them to see what's actually happening on their system. So the ideal project for us is when we can work with one of our members and the regulator is at the table supporting what we're doing. So yes, it's absolutely part of our work.
Got it. Now, just for those listening who are wondering, if you want to look into this more, discover some of those key validators, key partners, key, I guess, affiliates, look into the content that's available with EnergyWeb. I'll put all the links below. But just to mention some, talking about the likes of Siemens, TEPCO, Shell, Vestas, TWC. I mean, the list goes on and on. You mentioned some of them, Duke Energy, you know, and they're linked to Duke. There's also investigations of the baseline with Duke University. And then we look at things like Solara, GE, which is a big one, Trust Power, Swiss Power. I mean, the list goes on, AGL. I will stop. But the reason why I mention these is, again, to really showcase that this is not, these aren't your typical listings that you see in 2017 energy initiatives on the blockchain, as you mentioned. Now, I want to touch on the process you went through. Now, regulation is something you brought up. And it's something that is very difficult to do when it comes to tokens themselves, especially in the US, for example, when we've seen the likes, for example, of certain startups. I won't mention them actually, but they've gone through the efforts and the rigor to become securities. Then there's efforts to be recognized properly as a utility token, you know, post mainnet, working system, operational, and having that sort of top-down support from the grassroots initiative that you built. So do you want to just comment on that? Have you looked further into the token itself, the EWT token, being, as is alleged, being regulated, being supported, and being respected by all the parties from the top, from, you know, the sectors where you really do need that green light, especially enterprise?
Certainly. So first, yes, and it was a non-starter if we could not achieve global utility status for this token. And of course, like every other token and decentralized asset and cryptocurrency that's out there, there's an immense amount of regulatory uncertainty in the future about what's going to happen. But so far, that is exactly the path we're on. And the evidence I can support there is, so we're a Swiss-based foundation. Again, we have offices everywhere in the United States, in Germany, in Barcelona, potentially in Asia. So we're an international organization, but housed in Switzerland. FINMA, the Swiss regulator, we are considered a utility token in Switzerland. We went through quite a bit of processes. This is why you have a Swiss foundation, because you're in collaboration with the regulator and they understand exactly what you're doing, which is important. That's why we chose Switzerland. That was actually key for our enterprises, right? So that the Swiss component. In the US, right, much trickier because the SEC still has not updated the way that they are officially looking at securities regulation, et cetera. Right. We did go through a long-term process with the SEC, submitting a lot of documentation on our project, speaking with them on multiple occasions, submitting even demos of our software and showing it. So from our perspective, again, through this process with the SEC, we believe we are a non-security token, is the language we've been coached to use. Not utility token yet, but non-security. Yep. Which is the reason we recently listed on Bitmart. It's a smaller exchange completely, and we're continuing to look at other exchanges. But the reason we chose Bitmart is because we did want to give some of our US companies and developers and anybody that's interested in building on top of the decentralized operating system access to the token, because Americans did not have access to it until recently. And so that was the process that concluded with the listing on Bitmart to bring the token to the US.
And I think a lot of people in the US appreciated that too, Jesse, even for those in the speculative arm, to be honest, because having that access in that inroad through a regulated exchange does really matter. It also sounds like, from what I'm hearing from you, that you also are looking for those kind of regulated entities, those kind of regulated exchanges that also support the ethos you're leading out. Now, one thing that's interesting is that when it comes to the US and regulation of cryptocurrencies, of crypto, of non-securities, even as you mentioned, and even the domain of the grey area of utilities, what's interesting is that they are very clearly looking at the post-mainnet validity of tokens themselves. They're looking at, okay, where's the proof in the operation, in the expansion of the ecosystem, and what you actually do. And if we look at things like Ethereum, absolute proof there, all the way to the SEC, when it comes to recognizing them as something more than, or something other, let's say, than a security. And that's been said and reiterated by the very powers that be in the SEC and CFTC. So in that respect, do you feel confident that you're going to follow the trend of Ethereum and be recognized not just globally, but in the US as having integrity right down to the token?
Certainly, yes. And the reason is the utility of our token. So maybe we could spend a minute on that,
Sure,
because
I love that.
frankly, having gone through this process with the SEC, I can say the most important thing is really being able to describe and show what a token is used for in a crypto economy.
Mm-hmm.
So EnergyWeb token, right? We've spoken about the EnergyWeb chain. We've spoken about the decentralized operating system. EnergyWeb tokens, like on Ethereum, are used to pay gas payments, right? So if you want to do something on the virtual machine, you have to pay the gas payments. There's a gas schedule. The validators are effectively performing the functions that miners do on the Ethereum mainnet, right? So those gas fees have to be paid. Incidentally, the gas fees on the EnergyWeb chain are much lower than the mainnet because we have that tighter validator set, but we don't need to go into that. So that's use case one for the token, a utility. But we are actually going to be issuing a re-release of our paper describing the decentralized operating system that actually talks about multiple utility functions of the token on top of the chain. And so I can give a few examples that are already alive. Basic one, Ethereum naming service. So just making it very easy to have a domain for a company to interact with the chain, that's paid in EWT. So that's another service that's paid via the utility token of the chain. I'll just riff through a list of some others. Messaging. Most of the applications we're talking about here that send messages between digital identities anchored to the chain, they actually use a server that's a node on the EnergyWeb decentralized operating system. Those messages and that messaging service paid in EWT. Similar architecture for data storage, for bridging, right? For all those bridges I described. That's a critical security function. So we use utility tokens to secure those bridges. There's a much bigger list here of what some of those other utility functions are. We've begun to speak about a few of those utility services. I think it's mainly the transaction validation and then the Ethereum naming service and the oracleization service that's currently available. But soon we will be releasing a deeper dive on these token economics of these other utility functions. So again, to bring it back to the regulatory front, the most important thing was being able to describe what are these tokens and what are they being used for and what use case are they supporting. That logic has to be there. Yeah,
absolutely. And also for those who are engaging, who are listening even now, many of them are actually considering the speculative aspect or the speculative value of this digital asset too, quite rightly, and that's fine because it's available. But what they are also demanding to understand more of the utility proof of this, or more of the non-security proof in terms of what it actually does. Now, on your website, one of the things that it does say is that there's not a requisite in terms of you don't have to necessarily use this for payment, mode when you can use other things. Do you want to just touch on that? Because there were those questions raised. And so we want to ensure that there is an actual need, not just an option.
Definitely. So, well, I mean, to be clear, it's an open source decentralized technology stack like all of the other ones in the space that we're talking about. Right. So, of course, any company could technically, and the same is true of Ethereum, right? You can copy paste the entire Ethereum code base and run a single node Ethereum blockchain on your computer, right?
Right. Jesse, just to be clear, what I meant was with regard to the actual token having that optionality built in, supposedly with regard to, say, for example, fiat payments. What I wanted to better understand was that aspect to make sure that there is that funneling of the use of the EWT.
No, so these let's break it apart. There's the validator nodes that are performing the validation of the blocks. Then let's call them utility nodes. Okay. So these are computers that are actually providing these different services. Those services will be paid in EWT, right? That's the entire function. Now, does that mean, just to be clear, I as a customer, Jesse's home using electricity, am I going to pay my bills in EnergyWeb token? We could technically architect something like that. But of course, utilities are by no means required to do something like that. We can facilitate payments using traditional currencies, digital or otherwise. But again, what I'm trying to emphasize is this EnergyWeb decentralized operating system is the narrow waist of the digital infrastructure of the grid. That narrow waist is going to be powered by EWT supporting the decentralized operating system.
I see. And that's the kind of, yeah, it does. And that's kind of what I wanted to hear, to be honest, because often we hear grey responses with regard to the actual functionality of a token itself, and it tends not to always be the core fuel that drives the ecosystem. What you're basically saying is that's exactly what the EWT does. And for someone who's looking at this, not just again in that utility frame or a developer frame, but even a participant in this very complex and convoluted crypto space, they also want to make sure that they are supporting the utility-centric nature of this, or the use cases as well. And they obviously have to be driven by the thing that they're interested in, which is EWT. So all good so far. I wanted to make sure that was, something that you could drive home, and I think you did with your response. Now, with regard to very interesting underlying frameworks and founders, I noticed that there were two that were really integral to building out EnergyWeb or influenced your team, and that's GridSingularity, and also, please correct me, but with regard to the data sciences, with regard to research, there was the Rocky Mountain Institute, I think it's called.
Yes.
Again, correct me if I'm wrong, but they seem to be the two parties that really supported the development of the EnergyWeb initiative.
Certainly. So the two co-founding organizations, not individuals, were Rocky Mountain Institute and GridSingularity, right? So, and if you think about my previous answer about the team, those two organizations match that. So GridSingularity came to the fore with background in blockchain, IT, what blockchain is capable of in energy, right? Rocky Mountain Institute is a think tank, an international think tank with deep energy sector experts. That's where I came from, right? So I was at Rocky Mountain Institute for a long time, helping utilities build digital solutions to do all of these cool things with assets that I keep talking about, right? Mm-hmm. So that was a really natural marriage at the time, where on the nonprofit Rocky Mountain Institute side, we see a huge need for digital infrastructure, and the GridSingularity side saying, hey, here's this complete wave of innovation coming with blockchain and decentral tech. Let's match up and bring EnergyWeb to market.
Got it. And it was interesting also because when you look at GridSingularity, for example, again, not to sort of introduce this idea of FOMO or hype, but Gavin Wood was directly involved, as I understand, with some of the aspects of GridSingularity. So when we talk about that, I want to just clear up some of the sort of, hype out there at the moment. Now, with D3 Tech connected to GridSingularity, specifically the D3A, we saw Tesla come up. We saw also the Autobidder. We know that there's sort of tech connections. We know there's use case connections there. Can you just touch on that, because it was so hyped, and clarify the Tesla call?
Yes, certainly. So unfortunately, I can't disclose projects that are in development or ongoing at any time. Okay. And I can't speak for GridSingularity in terms of what they have going on with projects and partners. Okay. The only thing I can say is that specifically the Flex toolkit that I've described on the decentralized operating system is being built to spec for Tesla Powerwalls and other Tesla energy storage systems. But unfortunately, I don't know if that's exactly what you're looking for, but that's the best I can do.
Get that reference, because obviously it was very much publicized. And just to clarify that it was also very much connected to GridSingularity, which again is connected to you. Now, Gavin Wood, no small player, someone who helped co-found Ethereum. He's leading out, the initiatives in GridSingularity, heavily involved in Berlin, and very much supporting you. A lot of cross-collaboration. Ed Hess as well. I've texted him briefly. He's a huge supporter of what you're doing. And he even tweeted to me or privately and said, this is just the beginning. So what are your thoughts on having this kind of support from these parties? The fact that you've got this strong foundation of blockchain support, of blockchain skill sets, of engineering, and then you've got really important sector support from Rocky Mountain Institute. It must be really good to have that foundation.
Oh, certainly. And it feels amazing to have that kind of backing, right? From the nonprofit philanthropic angle, from the deeply networked kind of ecosystem that Ed Hess really has in the Ethereum ecosystem. And like you said, we worked with Gavin and Parity from day one to really make sure we were nailing this initial proof of authority architecture of the chain. The Parity client is still the primary client of the chain. They've been a great partner since the launch. So yes, I think we do have all of the pieces assembled. Now the real work is for us getting as many of these utilities going enterprise grade on the decentralized operating system as possible.
Got it. Now, one of the things that you talked about before, I guess we could call them products or technologies, is Flex and Origin. Obviously, some of your key members like Ian Kelly's leading out Flex. and then there's some other key members. I haven't written them down, but they are also leading out Origin. Now, are they going to be the two core sort of foci for building this out, leading this out, or are you going to build in more as we approach 221? What exactly is your plan with regard to the offerings and the tool suite?
So I'm sure we will uncover new requirements and build out additional toolkits. There's already been some exploration into finance. So effectively using the decentralized operating system to unlock effectively crowdsourced finance into new renewable energy projects. Now, this is a space that 4 or 5 startups in crypto have attempted to break into, but my read of the market is it hasn't blown up yet. But that is another toolkit that I could see coming to market. We would likely do that with partners, right? Because then we have to start talking about issuing second layer or third layer security tokens that represent ownership rights to different assets, right? But that is certainly another toolkit that we have our eye on for 2021, 2022. The only other thing I'd say is those 2 toolkits, Origin and Flex, they sound simple. Those cover that $2 trillion energy market I was talking about. If you can assign digital identities to every asset in the electricity grid and enable utilities to integrate those things into a market, you've won. I mean, that is the battle. So even though it looks simple, there's an immense amount of sophistication and complexity in just bringing Flex and Origin to market.
Right, and I was actually reading a bit of an article about that from Walter, the CEO, and he was talking about the different standards that are also being used for the DIDs, for those decentralized identification sort of technologies as well. Do you want to just comment on that? Because that's quite innovative, how you are creating your own standards to address this need, and also to forward this to market, forward this to the enterprise sector, and also have a stronghold on first mover advantage.
Yeah, so the decentralized identifier standard by the W3C, so they're the ones that kind of pushed it, and it's being used in a lot of different crypto ecosystems, is a perfect fit for us. One, it deals with GDPR issues around data privacy. I'm also sitting right here in California. We have the California Privacy Act also, very similar to GDPR, meaning that we really have to deal with customer data privacy. Decentralized approaches to identity are an amazing tool for ensuring customer data privacy. So that was point 1. Point 2 was just making it possible for any asset to participate in an energy market. So with a decentralized identity, it's pretty simple. If I'm Jesse, I submit a claim and I say, hey, everybody, that's my electric car. And then the dealer can approve that claim. And then by virtue of that approval going forth, you can trust that that car is what it says it is and is owned by who it says it is owned by. Right. So that decentralized approach to identity makes a ton of sense for the energy sector. And that's why we ran with it, versus having a centralized approach to identity management where a single utility has to drive in their truck to a specific location and check that X plus X equals Y. This decentralized approach gives us much more freedom in terms of ways to establish trust with different identities.
Yes, and we're hearing that a lot also with supply chains that are now starting to come forth, hence the baseline and including a lot of those. Surely there's a lot of cost saving, there's a lot of benefits for businesses, for corporations as well, who start to onboard this value proposition, start to utilize the DID as well. Now, in the pipeline, Jesse, are you aware of, I'm assuming you are, but I don't know how much you're going to tell me, of more of these so-called applications that, you have your own term through the FlexiDAO and through other things that they're building, but is there a lot more coming in terms of not just interest, not just enterprise parties that are, facilitating the security of the system, but is there going to be a lot more evidence of use case through proof, empirically, where we can start to see not just experimentation, but actual business being done?
I should not be the chief commercial officer of EnergyWeb 1 year from now if we can't announce at least 5 additional deployments. So not just new validators, right? Not just new members. The Vodaphone announcement we just had on the IoT side that we may want to spend a moment on, those are great because those are technology partnerships, right? And we need more of those. But the real prize here is getting impact. Impact means new applications built by members in our ecosystem. So I should, whenever this goes live, we should track it. But that's what we live and breathe at this point. Yeah.
Well, Jesse, let's talk about that, because you say 5 and you say that so liberally and so simply, but really the scope from the evidence we've seen is that when you even talk about one in the context of EnergyWeb, it's really big. So let's touch on Vodaphone for a moment. Now, in Australia, it's not the leading telco, it's just not, but globally, Vodaphone is a huge deal. So let's unpack this in terms of what it actually means, and also in the sense of real partnerships, because in crypto, there's a lot of BS. There's a lot of superficial BS and a lot of superficial partnerships. So, try and, sell us the reality of what you stand for when it comes to real partnerships and what Vodaphone as an example means.
So Vodaphone for EnergyWeb, like many of the other partners in our ecosystem, is a go-to-market partner. We are a small 25-person organization relentlessly focused on building this open source and integrating it. We don't have a deep bench of IoT engineers or a enterprise-grade IoT platform that can handle billions of devices sending messages through it. Vodafone does. So they were a key partner for us to bring into and make a key part of the decentralized operating system stack. Mm-hmm. What's actually going on there? We're conducting a technical integration right now to make sure that the decentralized operating system syncs with their IoT functionalities. But more importantly, it's what you asked me, Brad, we are trying to find an initial set of companies to jointly deploy their capabilities and a decentralized operating system. And of course, when we get there, we'll announce it. So that's the real focus.
Right. Well, give us some hints, Jesse, because you know way more than you're telling. With regard to Vodaphone, obviously it took a long time. You as a commercial rep, you would have gone through a lot of processes, a lot of meetings, no doubt, a lot of explanations of what your value prop is to these corporations like Vodaphone. So just give us a bit of a hint. We all want to know more. What's coming for the enterprise integrations? What's coming for those partnerships?
The holy grail of flexibility in a low carbon electric system are electric vehicles, right? And Voda has wonderful connections with automotive OEMs, original equipment manufacturers. That's what I would keep my eye on in terms of the coming months, is what's going to come out of EnergyWeb, what's going to come out of our partnership with Vodafone and our members in terms of integrations with electric vehicle manufacturers, because that is the, again, holy grail of flexibility on the grid.
Okay, so holy grails. I like the fact that you're also leveraging these connections, in that global sense where you're starting to build out, this, not just this narrative, but you're building out and showcasing the real value of this through onboarding legitimate partnerships. That the domino effect is really happening for you at a very large scale, at a very serious enterprise scale. Now, there's other things that have been happening, like, for example, your grants that are now available. If you want to find out more, I'll try and put that info below. That was one of the things I noticed was one of the hot developments, aside from the ones we've mentioned. Now, with regard to tech, I just want to touch on that for a sec. Now, open source, yes. You have technologies available or interfaces available like Volta, the Explorer, GitHub activity. How transparent is it all right now in terms of access?
100%. Everything we do is as open source as you can get. We use a hard copyleft license, so it's a GPL3 license. As open and transparent as you can be. Okay.
Well, that sums it up pretty quickly. Now, with regard to membership, I want to try and get this clear. Now, we know that members, are part of the design of EnergyWeb. What I wanted to find out from you is how can someone join, who can join, and essentially, what do you get out of it?
Definitely. So anybody can join the EnergyWeb, and we're actually revamping our membership program now. Before I go into that, just to be clear, go to our website. You can download the client right now. There's quite a bit of documentation on all the different software and toolkits. Enjoy our GitHub repository. We're doing new commits all the time. So that's just go to town and check it out. If you want to engage more deeply, we do have this membership program. It has a couple of different levels, and anybody can go ahead and join that membership program. The key thing to note, though, is in order to be a validator on the main chain, right, you need to be a certain kind of member. Right now, it's effectively, you have to be an energy market participant. So an organization that really is actually a part of this energy sector. And that's not EnergyWeb speaking there. That was a decision of the validator set, that's the way that the current validator set is configured. Again, all the information and kind of requirements on this front can be found on the EnergyWeb website, but that's the membership program at a high level. Beyond the validator node, generally speaking, people join us because they want to learn about the business case in blockchain and energy. So that's typically the utilities joining us. Startups like to join because they obviously want to sell into the utilities that are part of the ecosystem. Mm-hmm. And again, primarily that's for corporates to help them go enterprise grade.
I see. There's so much overlap actually with what you're building out with Baseline's initiative as well. I mean, I'm hearing so many synergies here. In that respect, I also want to talk to you about Chainlink, because as I was reading through your own literature, Chainlink came up, not just even with Baseline actually. So I want to find out if you're aware of any of that collaboration working with Chainlink, because obviously they are key components, they're key drivers of Baseline as well, with regard to, offering what arguably is an enterprise-centric Oracle system and network. So that's really what they are. So, are you aware of any collaborations in that sort of sphere?
Definitely. So we have a bridge now, and we're using Chainlink as an Oracle service for our stack. I'd have to pull one of our engineers or our CTO on to go into detail on exactly how it's being used by our ecosystem, because I can't speak to that level of detail. But yes, that's one of the first actual integrations we did, I think maybe a quarter or two ago.
Yep. Got it. And we can always talk about that in another interview. Now, with regard to investors, I want to touch on this because you had some key investors like 1KX, some other crypto capital companies. I won't name them because I wasn't sure which were and which weren't. But how important was it to secure funding from those parties, given that, correct me if I'm wrong again, you did no ICO, you did no IEO, and there is no pre-mine because that's not how you're built. So how important was it initially to get some of that financial support and backing?
So the big thing for us was, as we brought up a couple of times, Brad, the network effect of who is coming into our ecosystem.
Right.
So our initial financial contributions and raise was purely invitation only, right? And so through our network, we did know some of those organizations that you just mentioned. Among others in the US, we have got some more, I don't know the best language to describe them, impact investors. So organizations that actually contribute to projects that are focused on the energy transition I mentioned previously.
Okay.
So we have a couple of organizations like that. So for all of them, we had to really know why they were coming at this project. What else could they contribute beyond finances, right? So bringing additional corporates to the table was critical for some of those organizations you mentioned. Being able to actually make introductions to key technology providers in the broader Ethereum ecosystem, that was a requirement, right? So we weren't just kind of blindly taking tickets from, crypto VCs all over the place. Every organization we brought in, we were quite strategic about.
And that's really interesting, Jesse, because obviously I could participate also in the ICOs, early on. And one of the things that, I like hearing from you is that you're really preventing those parties that are just there to invest, and more so look at those who have that genuine industry-specific, commonality, that common thread with you. So much respect for that focus. Now, one thing that you're not going to like when I ask you this, but one of the things that I noticed is that those parties that do have that common goal, of that energy specific industry, also trying to uplift enterprise in that area. I noticed that some of those parties, the capital firms also have strong associations, particularly in the US. So immediately I was thinking, okay, if you have exchanges now and you clearly need liquidity, I'm thinking Coinbase, I'm thinking Kraken, I'm even thinking Binance in the future, not to FOMO, but you do need better exchanges as you move forward, arguably. Are you looking at other exchanges?
Our ambition is global, right? We're going for as much access to the token as possible, and more importantly, potentially, maximum trust from enterprises. Maximum trust means tier 1 exchanges, but not just that, custodial service, right? That gets left off the table so much when we talk about enterprise adoption of blockchain and major token holdings. So right. Yes, we are aggressively in conversation with multiple different exchanges, tier 2, tier 1, globally.
Got it. So roadmap, Jesse, do you have any idea when they're going to make moves? Because everyone that I talk to in this sector, even when I'm looking at researchers, a lot of people are really hyped about this. A lot of really excited about the next step that EWT as a token is going to take as well, not to mention the whole scope of the EnergyWeb ecosystem. So roadmap-wise, what's coming?
Unfortunately, today, right now, can't give any specific dates on what's coming in terms of additional exchanges.
Okay.
We will be as forthcoming as we can on probably the Telegram channel and additional announcements. Hope to have some good news on that front in the next 2 weeks, at least with timing on another exchange, but I can't commit to anything right here today.
You heard it from Jesse, not me. Now, market cap, let's talk about that, because that's another thing, Jesse. There's not a lot of clarity coming from CMC at the moment with regard to the whole nature of what your cap is. So I wanted to get it from the horse's mouth, to use those other better terms than that, I apologize. But with regard to distinguishing between, for example, the market cap and the circulating supply, and also importantly, how much of it is actually held by the foundation and members of, because that's something that also makes it even more scarce when you know that. So do you want to just touch on the facts with regard to the token?
Sure, let's talk through that for a minute. And on CoinMarketCap, again, there's just requirements on the number of exchanges we're listed on, and hopefully that we're working with them as quickly as we can to get that officially listed. Okay. Let's just talk back from the top. So 100 million total tokens that were included in the Genesis block. And if we break down from there, again, all of this is completely shown on the EnergyWeb chain paper that I think is linked to on the website. There is a table that breaks down exactly which category is holding how many tokens, just to be totally clear.
Okay.
Again, there are 10 million held by founders. So the organization, Rocky Mountain Institute and GridSingularity, those have a 2-year lockup. So that's locked up until June of next year, because we launched the chain of June of the previous year. Mm-hmm. There are just under 20 million tokens that are managed by the foundation. Now, what's worth noting here is because we are a Swiss foundation, we have no shareholders, right? It's impossible for us to just liquidate or dump those tokens or something for no good reason. We are regulated by the Swiss regulators. Every single token that's used, whether we're talking about the tokens for the grant program or tokens that we sell, have to be in direct support of our mission, right? So this is very different than other crypto projects where all of the founders are individuals. There's zero controls, right? For us, the tokens owned and managed by the foundation have very strict controls put on them.
So in that respect, you almost have the Swiss watchdog, you know, in the sense of making
sure that
there's real reasons, and you have to validate them through, you know, your own actions or any of those members of the foundation. I think that's something the public just didn't know and don't know. So it's important that we have that peace of mind that even you guys, right from the the back end, don't have full control of the tokens as well.
Absolutely.
Oh, okay. So essentially 20% you mentioned, 1/5 of the whole tokens is in that in that allocation, in that sort of foundation allocation. Can you just continue on with explaining the whole market cap down to circulating supply and,
yeah. Right. So before circulating supply, the other categories very briefly. So there's an additional 10 million tokens that are mined over 10 years. And then there's an additional close to, I don't know the exact count, but it's about 1/3 of the total token supply is in something called the community fund. This is something that is similar to, if folks follow Polkadot, an on-chain treasury. So basically, this is a large stash of tokens that accumulate over time. So they're not all there right now. Basically, every time a block is mined, some go to the miners, some go into the community fund. Again, the community fund is a significant store of tokens that has to be invested into our mission. Now, there will be different governance around the community fund. We're not going to be the ones saying it's used X, Y, and Z. There's going to be some different kind of governance mechanisms put into place on that community fund. But again, those tokens have to be used in support of the foundation's mission, which is something that probably does get a bit mixed or missed when you look through that token table. So that's what the community fund is.
Got it.
If we look today, I think the circulating supply is something like it's between 47 and 48 million. I don't know the exact number, and we have to look at what the price is, but it's on Bitmart and it is on Liquid, so we'd have to find out what the price is. Yep. So that would be the math for the market cap as it is today.
I see. Now, if we pull that across into, for example, the top 100, that's where you're going to slot in somewhere in that scale. Right. Now, many people have argued that you're just, you're too high in terms of a market cap for many of these speculators, for example. But when you look at, for example, the likes of Chainlink, which essentially is middleware technology, it's a fundamental technology to execute smart contracts. It's an enabler, essentially, as are many other Oracle projects that are important as well. They have, a plus $1 billion overall value proposition right now. Now, if you think about when they first started, had similar sort of cap to essentially what you're suggesting with the supply. So are you confident that despite the high entry into the top 100, that you can really move forward and showcase what you're all about?
Extremely confident. Let's just think about the context again of the industry that we're operating in. I'll say it again. We are trying to position the decentralized operating system as this narrow digital waste of a multi-trillion-dollar industry, right? So that's a kind of very top-down way to think about a potential market cap for this digital infrastructure. if utilities around the world are truly building applications that run on top of this decentralized stack, that's what at the end of forget speculation, right? That's what we're talking about with the actual measure of success for our ecosystem is where is this technology being used in the real world? How many other crypto ecosystems can actually strive for that, right? It's so much of it is driven by speculation now. We all understand that. Stakeholders across the ecosystem understand that. We are driving for real enterprise adoption of a public blockchain.
Got it. Now, let's talk about this in a really open, pragmatic sense. Real is rare. There's so much BS in the space, even in the top 100, so many of them won't be there in the future, I would argue. That's my own view. So are you confident that you could even reach into top 5 or top 10 in the current scenario we see, given that you're so focused on forging real partnerships, real technology, real use cases for a real and robust platform?
Our mission is to decarbonize the global electricity sector. And it might sound cheesy to keep coming back to that, but I speak truly. The reason half of our team comes from energy and climate, and the reason the other half of our team are developers who could be making a lot more by working at a Fortune 100 company building blockchain stuff is because of our mission. If we don't achieve broad commercial adoption of the decentralized operating system, which would kick us into that top tier of market cap, we won't have accomplished our mission in that kind of 5 to 10 year horizon. So absolutely, it's our intention to achieve success on that level, because that means we're having real world impact on our mission.
Absolutely, Jesse. And talking of real world, we're talking about many different regions of the globe as well, from Thailand to Germany to Spain to Australia, and pretty much every country, I'd suggest in the future in some shape or form, or at least continent, is going to be engaging arguably with EnergyWeb, with your tech stack and with your token, hopefully as well. I want to thank you sincerely on behalf of all people who wanted to know more about EnergyWeb. This was a free interview for those wondering, no other agenda but education and information. If you'd like to know more, Jesse, where is the best place to go in terms of educating ourselves about EnergyWeb and everything that you offer as a team?
Head to energyweb.org, and all of the information should be there, ranging from the membership model, the token, what we're about, GitHub and everything. Website should be your one-stop shop.
Got it. Now, I'll put them in the description below as well, just to facilitate those connections, to make sure you can get primary source information, or at least documentation that leads into it. Obviously, Telegram is available and other social media platforms to directly engage with the team themselves. Now, with regard to competitors, you've mentioned that traditional competitors of the past, in terms of a crypto sense, really aren't the kind of in the same league, or you've at least alluded to that. Now you're really hitting the narrative on the head, right, or the nail on the head rather, with regard to addressing this from a consortium sort of an enterprise gear. It's going to be exciting to see how this evolves in the future with all aspects of your design, from foundation to chain to token, and even the whole tech stack, that's built in. With regard to that, do you want to just quickly touch on access with regard to wallets, Jesse?
Yes. So multiple wallets integrated right now. My crypto wallet, I believe, was released today. With Trezor is integrated, and Ledger. So those are the primary 2 hardware wallets. And if you go to wallet.energyweb.org, there's an entire user interface to try and help folks more easily access the token.
Got it. Okay, so obviously you built in some of those key means to essentially store the value that and the token itself, and making sure that's easy. So hopefully there's also documentation for the newbies out there that want to start to play around. What about marketing? Now, many people, in the space are very zealous on the marketing side of it. Some, in the DeFi space that I know of, like Teller, they like to really focus on the tech, not as much on marketing at the moment. What is your stance on this? Will you be leading out more of a marketing strategy to support your move forward?
Most of our marketing, if not all, is going to be focused, frankly, Brad, on the conversation we've had. What new projects are coming onto the ecosystem? What new technology are we developing? And who else is using the tech? That's what our marketing is going to be focused on, because we do think that's a differentiator from a lot of the other crypto space. Less hot air, more impact. We think at the end of the day, that's going to drive our growth and our sustainability.
Well, Jesse, that's a great way to finish this off. Talking about being impactful, that being the focus, real deal enterprise, real deal tech, real deal innovation when it comes to this specific use case of the energy sector. Really exciting to hear what digitization and digital assets mean in the next phase, of technological evolution. You're part of that. You're literally part of that first mover advantage. And I applaud you all for all the years of work you've built, you've put in to get to this far, and clearly there's a lot more to come. So on behalf of all of us, Jesse, thank you very much. You are the Chief Commercial Officer for EnergyWeb. Hopefully, mate, we can catch up again to really break this down into bite-sized chunks and start to really isolate the core value propositions of EnergyWeb, both for now and the future, as you continue this very important initiative and project and startup and essentially token to lead the way.
Thanks, Brad. Excited to carry the journey forward and love the show. Thank you so much.
You're welcome, mate. Take care.